All right, welcome to another deep dive where we take some fascinating topic and really uh, dig in and extract all the really valuable knowledge that you might want to know about it. And today, we are going to be going deep on a really uh, rich and surprisingly relevant area, analytic philosophy in early modern India. Now, if you're someone who is like steeped in Western philosophy, and you might be like, wait, what?
Yeah, right. It's like, oh, yeah, we're taking this from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's a really fantastic resource. And we're going to be kind of using this as a lens to examine this intellectual landscape. It's almost like encountering a philosophical sibling across both like time and culture.
Exactly. So our mission on this deep dive is to really explore the core principles and methods of what's called Navya Nyaya, which is a major school within this early modern Indian analytic tradition. We want to kind of understand what was driving them, what were their inquiries,
Yeah.
and importantly, why their approach to these philosophical puzzles might resonate with, you know, someone who appreciates that kind of deep understanding in a way that doesn't take like forever. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's like getting to that aha moment.
Absolutely.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Let's get into it.
So the story of Navya Nyaya, it means new Nyaya or new reason school. It has a really fascinating intellectual evolution, right? So around the 11th or 12th century, there were these two already established Indian philosophical traditions, early Nyaya and Vaiśeṣika. Early Nyaya, which had its roots in Gautama Akolpada's Nyaya Sutra, was really deeply concerned with logic, epistemology, the theory of knowledge, and the art of debate itself. Vaiśeṣika, stemming from Gautama's Vaiśeṣika Sutra, focused more on ontology, the nature of being, what exists, what doesn't.
So it wasn't just like they, merged together. Like the Navya suggests something more than just a blending of two things.
Right, precisely. So Navya Nyaya didn't just combine these two schools, they actually integrated and advanced both the Nyaya approach to knowing and the Vaiśeṣika understanding of what exists fundamentally.
Hmm.
And so a really crucial part of this development was the creation of a very, very precise technical language.
Oh, interesting.
This wasn't just about like obscuring things or making terminology difficult, right? This was a very precisely crafted tool that allowed them to really clarify what they were discussing and to dissect and resolve these intricate problems with a lot of rigor.
I can already see like the connection to like symbolic logic and like, ways that in the West, like we formalize language.
Exactly. It's a parallel development almost. And it's very interesting as a philosopher to see those similarities.
Mhm.
And so this precision wasn't just confined to abstract thought, right? They actually applied these techniques in very, very versatile ways in poetics, linguistics, even legal theory.
Wow. So this is like a toolkit that had a huge impact.
Absolutely.
So when we think about this new school, where did they really kind of make their mark?
So the foundational text that we often point to is Gagage's monumental work called Jewel of Reflection on the Truth. In Sanskrit, it's the Tapasintamant. This text really, really laid the groundwork for about 4 centuries of really intense philosophical innovation. People like Raghunatha, Jagadusha, and Gadadhar, who are all really key figures in this tradition, were all working with and elaborating upon Gagage's work. But the problem is that the technical language, although very, very effective, was so sophisticated that it made it very difficult for people outside the school to access it.
So it's like the very strength of it, the precision led to this kind of inaccessibility,
Exactly. So by the 17th and 18th centuries, there was this growing need to simplify things,
Right.
to create these kind of manuals or compendia of these powerful ideas to make them more widely accessible.
Okay.
So the text that we're going to be looking at today is one of those. It's called the Manual of Reason, or in Sanskrit, it's called Tarkasadgraha. And it's written by a guy named Annamphita, and it also has a commentary that we're going to be drawing from. It's called the Deepika. And it even earned a really funny nickname, which was Balagadadhari, which translates to Beginner's Guide to Gadahara.
Hey, perfect.
It really points to its function of making these ideas more accessible to people.
That's great. I mean, that's ideal for us.
Absolutely.
So this manual of reason, what kind of philosophical terrain does it cover?
So it's actually a pretty comprehensive text. It lays out the Vaiśeṣika theory of categories, which is a very interesting blend of metaphysics, philosophy of mind, and even kind of almost like early scientific classification, right?
Right.
And it lays out the epistemology, methodology, and logic that was typical of Navya Nyaya thought.
Cool.
And then it goes on to have these really interesting discussions over a wide range of topics. So it really serves as a good introduction to this later phase of Indian analytic philosophy.
Okay, so they have this like very intricate system. How did they actually go about doing philosophy? Like, what was the kind of core of their method of inquiry?
So their methodology, which actually comes from Vaiśeṣika originally, but it was adopted and refined by the Navya Nyaya, was very structured and revolved around this threefold procedure.
Okay.
So that involves enumeration, definition, and examination.
Okay.
Yeah. And so we can kind of break down these steps and, keep in mind as we do that the precision that's valued in philosophy today.
All right. Yeah, let's do that. Let's start with enumeration.
So enumeration in Sanskrit is called uddesha. It's basically the foundational step, right?
Okay.
And what it involves is simply listing or naming each object or concept that you are going to analyze.
Okay.
It's like identifying the subject matter of your investigation.
Makes sense. I mean, you've got to know what you're talking about before you can really analyze it.
Exactly.
Okay. So then definition.
So definition is called lakkhana, and this is really where their commitment to precision shines. It involves proposing a characteristic of the named object that uniquely distinguishes it from every other object.
I got you.
Right. So a good example of this would be like the Manual of Reason emphasizes that a proper definition of a class of things provides a characteristic that is coextensive with that class. That means it applies to all members and only members of that class. So consider like defining a cow. You might say a cow is that which has a dewlap.
Okay, that makes sense.
And so the really important point here, methodologically, is that they weren't trying to capture some like hidden essence of what it means to be a cow.
Right.
They were more concerned with establishing a kind of reliable and identifiable trait. Like, how do you identify a cow?
Right. So like establishing the criteria rather than trying to grasp some like underlying metaphysical reality of a cow or essence.
Right. It's like a diagnostic conception of definition rather than an essentialist conception.
Okay. That's a very important distinction. So, and that leads us to examination.
Right. So examination in Sanskrit is parika.
Okay.
And this is really where the kind of logical rigor of Navya Nyaya comes to the fore. It involves employing the pramach, the recognized sources or means of knowledge, to critically assess whether the distinguishing characteristic is appropriate for the object or not. And they were especially vigilant in identifying and eliminating faulty definitions.
Okay. Faulty in what way?
So there are two main ways a definition can be faulty. One is if it's overcovering. In Sanskrit, it's called ativyapti.
Okay.
And that means the definition applies too broadly, right?
Okay.
So, for example, if you were to define a bird as like that which has wings, right?
Yeah.
That would include bats, which we don't consider birds in the standard classification.
Yeah, that's a bad definition.
Exactly, it's overcovering. And then the opposite problem is undercovering. In Sanskrit, it's avyapti, and that means the definition's too narrow. So if you were to say, like, a dog is that which has a short tail,
Right.
then that would exclude a lot of dogs.
That would be undercovering. Yeah. Okay, so the ideal is like right in the sweet spot.
Exactly. It has to perfectly align with the extension of the concept. And what's really striking about this is that this pattern, this enumeration, definition, and examination, you see it repeated over and over and over again in these texts. Like in the Manual of Reason, it's a very pervasive methodological commitment.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. Yeah. So you can see the kind of like the echoes of that, like in the West and even today. It's like you want to, like when we do philosophy, we try to be as precise and clear as possible and to test our claims, basically.
Precisely.
Okay. That's awesome. Okay. So let's talk about the, you mentioned the Vaiśeṣika system of categories.
Yeah.
What were those intended to, like, what were they classifying, basically?
Right. So the Vaiśeṣika system of categories, or padartha, was basically their attempt to provide a classification of all fundamental types of existence, like everything that can be said to be.
Okay.
And so they had 7 categories that they used, and I'll just list them for you. So the first one is substance, or dravya. The second is quality, or gut. The third one is motion, or action, or karma. Fourth one is universal, or samanya. Fifth is particularity, or differentiator, or vishe. Sixth is inherence, or samavaya. And the last one is absence, or abhava.
Okay. That's a pretty exhaustive list. And you said like some of these are further like subdivided or...
Yeah. So like they identify 9 distinct kinds of substances and 24 different types of qualities, etc.
Wow. Okay. So, I mean, when you look at this list, is there any kind of like overarching structure or organizing principle to it? Or was it more like they just kind of like identified all these fundamental concepts?
So that's a question that has been really occupied by scholars of this tradition,
Okay.
right? Like what constitutes a category? And so the Manual of Reason actually gives us a clue here. It provides an etymological analysis of the term padartha.
Okay.
So padartha, it says, is the artha, the meaning of a pada, a word.
Interesting. So like the way they carved up reality was like kind of connected to how they carved up language, basically.
Exactly. And there are several lines of evidence to support that interpretation. So some scholars have observed that there are striking parallels between the Vaiśeṣika system and the structure of Sanskrit grammar.
Oh, interesting.
Right. And also, a really recurring pattern in their philosophical argumentation involves justifying the existence of something like a substance or a quality by arguing that it provides the best explanation for certain features of our linguistic practice.
You give me an example of that.
So their arguments for the reality of space often hinged on its role in grounding the objective truth of directional terms.
Okay.
Right, like east and west, north and south. So if we're going to talk about something being to the east or to the west, there needs to be some space.
Right.
Otherwise, what are we talking about?
So they were trying to like ground their metaphysics in the way we use language. Okay, that's very cool. So were there any attempts within the tradition to like establish a kind of more logical or a priori justification for, why these 7 categories?
Yes, so there have been several scholarly attempts to reconstruct the system in a more foundational way.
Okay.
So Othely, for example, proposed this reconstruction based on this fundamental dichotomy between positive and negative notions.
Okay.
So he says we have existent, and then the negative one would be non-existent, which would be abhava.
Right.
And then, so from there, he says, okay, well, what about the existent things? Well, you have kind of properties, and then you have the common substratum for all these properties, which would be substance, dravya.
Okay.
And then you differentiate among the properties based on how they are instantiated. So you have those residing jointly in many objects, which would be universals, samanya, and then those inhering in individual things. And within that category, he says, well, you have the ones that are more persistent, qualities, guta, and then you have the ones that are more transient, motion, karma. And then the rest of the categories are kind of brought in as they are needed.
Okay.
So inherence, samavaya, particularity, visha are brought in as they are needed to account for specific tenets within the system. But this particular reconstruction has encountered certain criticisms, right? It relies on distinctions that aren't really explained in the system itself, and it doesn't seem to accommodate all 7 of the categories all that well.
So not a perfect reconstruction.
Yeah, not a perfect reconstruction. There was another attempt, like Potter, for example, proposed another reconstruction. But even when we look at the Manual of Reason's own attempts to define the categories, they run into problems.
In what way?
Well, so, for example, the definitions of substance and quality appear to be mutually circular, unless one already accepts the existence of universals.
Gotcha.
Right. So, substance, for example, is defined as, that which possesses the universal substancehood, right? And quality is defined as that which possesses the universal qualityhood. So this becomes problematic unless you're already committed to there being these universals.
So it's like a question-begging definition almost.
Exactly. And so there was another philosopher, Udayana, who tried to kind of approach this problem from a different angle.
Okay.
He said, okay, well, let's take inherence, samavaya, as our most fundamental relation.
Okay.
And from there, we can kind of derive the other categories. So he proposed a 3-fold classification of entities based on how they participate in this relation of inherence. So the first group is those that don't inhere in anything else but are themselves inhered in. The second group is those that both inhere and are inhered in. And the third group is those that only inhere in things, but nothing inheres in them. And so he tries to map these onto substances and qualities. So group 1, those that don't inhere in anything else would be your substances.
Okay.
And group 3, those that only inhere those would be your universals. Because universals are in things, but nothing's in a universal itself.
Right.
And so then group 2, the intermediary group, would include the composite substances, qualities, and motions. And then he tries to further differentiate within group 2 based on what kind of things inhere in those entities. So in qualities, only qualities and motions can inhere. But in composite substances, qualities, motions, and other composite substances can inhere.
Okay.
And so finally, he has to bring in the category of vishal, the particularity or differentiator, to account for how the eternal substances, the atoms, are distinct from one another.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So Vaiśeṣika is there to differentiate between the atoms.
So even like two atoms of the same type, like two hydrogen atoms, for example, would have a different Vaiśeṣika.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it seems like they were really grappling with these like deep questions about identity and individuation.
Right.
And even the Manual of Reason itself points out that it's difficult to define a substance as the substratum of qualities because they held this doctrine that substances initially exist without any qualities at all.
Okay. So you can see the kind of like the philosophical work that they're doing there. That's really cool. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about one of those categories. Let's talk about physical substance.
Okay.
How did they conceive of the basic material stuff out of which the world was composed?
So, as I said, there were 9 distinct types of substances according to the Vaiśeṣika system. But there was this subclass of 5 that were given a special status. These were called bhuta. And it's often translated as the physical elements or the primary substances, right? And these were earth, water, fire, air, and akasha.
Okay, so like earth, air, fire, water.
Huh.
That sounds kind of like almost like our elements, right?
Yeah, but they were not quite like our elements.
Okay.
And so a bhuta was characterized as a substance that possesses a specific sensible quality.
So like the earth we would associate with odor, for example.
Right, but it wasn't quite that simple. Initially, they might have had this kind of simplistic view,
Okay.
but they quickly realized that like the relationship was more complex.
Okay.
So like earth isn't just perceived through smell. It also has like visual properties, tactile properties.
Yeah.
And so the kind of mapping between substances and sensory qualities became more nuanced. So they said, okay, well, earth has odor, taste, color, and touch. Water has taste, color, and touch, and so on and so forth. The Manual of Reason attempts to define them a bit more definitively. So it suggests that like the way you know it's earth is that it has an odor. Water has a cold touch. Fire has a hot touch. Air was particularly difficult for them to define. Right?
Okay.
They often had to define it negatively as like that which has touch but lacks color.
Interesting. So, I mean, it does sound kind of like they're, thinking in a kind of pre-scientific way. But like, were they thinking about these as like literal physical elements in the same way that we would think about the elements, on the periodic table?
So some scholars have proposed interpretations that are kind of like metaphorical, right? They say, well, maybe Earth is just a metaphor for like the solid state, water, liquid, gas.
Okay, yeah.
And fire would be heat, thermal.
Okay.
But there isn't really any good textual evidence to support that.
Okay.
And the texts don't really talk about like transmutation of elements in the way that we would talk about, chemical reactions.
Okay, so like they don't think that like fire turns into water or something like that.
Right, exactly. So another interpretation, and one that I find very interesting, is to see their theory as more of a logical analysis of sense data.
Okay.
It's almost like they're saying, look, we have these senses.
Right.
What's the best way to explain the data that we're getting from those senses?
Right. And so they were very interested in like correlations between different sensory modalities.
Okay.
So like we often see and touch the same object, right?
Yeah.
So there's something that's common to both the visual and tactile domains.
Right.
But then sometimes we can touch things that we can't see. And so they said, well, there must be something that can be touched but not seen, and that's air.
Okay, yeah. So they're trying to like really think about how these senses give us information about the world, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that's really cool. So did they think that these physical substances, the bhuta, were like ultimately composed of something even more fundamental? Like, did they have a concept of like atomism, for example?
Yeah, they did.
Okay.
So the Manual of Reason reiterates the standard Vaiśeṣika doctrine that the first 4 bhuta, so earth, water, air, and fire, exist in 2 forms: as indivisible atoms called paramat, and as composite entities that are formed by the combination of these atoms.
Yeah. So they defined an atom as something that's indestructible. It's indivisible, which means it doesn't have any component parts.
Okay.
And it possesses this minimal small dimension. It's called onyu.
Okay, so what were their like main arguments for like why there must be these kind of like indivisible units?
So their argument basically rested on empirical observation, right?
Right.
They said, okay, well, look around you. Everything you see is composite, right? It's made up of parts.
Right.
even the smallest speck of dust you can see in, like, a sunbeam, it must be made up of smaller parts, even though you can't see them.
Okay.
And so they posited this kind of like hierarchical structure, right?
Sure.
They said, well, the smallest perceptible entity is what we call a triad. And a triad is made up of 3 dyads.
Okay.
And each dyad is made up of 2 atoms.
Okay.
And the atom is the fundamental, indivisible building block.
Okay. So they established that there's like imperceptibly small parts. But like, how did they argue that it like had to terminate? Like, why couldn't it just be infinitely divisible?
So the Manual of Reason has this very ingenious argument against infinite divisibility.
Okay.
So it basically says, imagine you have this huge mountain, Mount Meru,
Okay.
and then you have a mustard seed.
Okay.
Now, if they were both infinitely divisible,
Yeah.
they would both have an infinite number of parts, right?
Yeah.
So they would have to be the same size.
Yeah.
So the argument rests on the fact that size is determined by the kind of arrangement of parts, right? Like the size, the number of the parts. So it's a really clever argument. But of course, it does rest on this assumption that the ultimate parts have to have some kind of definite size.
Right, right. So like the person who believes in infinite divisibility might say, no, the size is like the extent of the stuff, the continuous stuff, not the number of discrete parts.
Precisely.
So it's a little bit question-begging, maybe.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
But still, it's a very interesting line of reasoning that was kind of foundational to their atomism.
Okay, cool. Okay, so let's talk about their metaphysics of number.
Okay.
You described this as like surprisingly sophisticated.
Yeah, it is. So the Navya-Nyaya understanding of number has actually been compared to Frege, right?
Wow. Okay, that's a pretty big, pretty high bar.
Yeah. And so the Manual of Reason actually initially presents what's called the older Vaiśeṣika view,
Okay.
which is that numbers are just qualities. Gooses.
Okay.
Right. So you have like quality of 1, quality of 2, and so on. And they go up all the way to very, very large numbers.
Okay.
But the problem with this view is that it runs into a contradiction within their own system.
How so?
Well, so the Vaiśeṣika system says that a quality can't inhere in another quality.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Qualities have to be of substances. But we do talk about numbers of qualities.
Right.
So, for example, we might say that in the Vaiśeṣika system, there are 24 qualities, right?
Yeah.
But if numbers are qualities, then how can you have a quality in another quality?
Yeah. So they need a better way of like accounting for what numbers are.
Precisely. And this led to a really sophisticated theory of number.
Okay.
So they developed this notion of paryapti. It's often translated as a completing relation or a pervading relation.
Okay, completing relation. So what does that mean?
So maybe the best way to illustrate this is to think about the difference between 2 statements. The first statement is, the table has wooden legs.
Okay.
And the second statement is, the table has 4 legs.
Okay.
Right. So in the first case, the property of being wooden inheres in each individual leg.
Right.
If the table has wooden legs, then each leg is wooden.
Makes sense.
But the second statement, the table has 4 legs, it doesn't imply that each leg is 4.
Right.
Right? 4-ness applies to the legs collectively.
Okay.
So how do we make sense of that? And that's where paryapti comes in.
Okay.
They said, okay, well, so the number 4 doesn't inhere in each individual leg. It's related to all of the legs jointly by this relation, this completing relation, paryapti.
So it doesn't attach to each individual, it attaches to the whole.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. And so Raghunatha, he kind of elaborated on this. He called it a self-linking relation.
Okay.
And it's especially true in the case of numerical properties. So when you say, like, this is 1 pod or these are 2 pods, right?
Right.
It's this relation, paryapti, that's doing the work there.
Okay.
And then Jagadisha further clarified this. He said that paryapti, it's like it delimits a property as residing in multiple objects taken together.
Okay.
And, a way to maybe simplify this is to think of, like, the number predicate itself as already kind of incorporating this completing aspect.
Okay.
Right. So instead of saying, like, 2 inheres in Venus and it also inheres in Mars, we can just say, like, R2 is a relation that holds between Venus and Mars.
Right.
And it's that relation that kind of brings in the number.
Okay, so it's almost like the number is a property of the pair, not each individual thing.
Exactly.
And so that kind of blocks the inference from Venus and Mars are 2 to Venus is 2.
Precisely.
Which doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Okay, yeah, that's a really clever way to get around that problem.
And so, Nyaya actually had a term for these kinds of properties. They called them Vaisajivatya Dharma, which literally translates to Proparables whose occurrence pervades a plurality of loci.
Yeah. And that's actually a really important distinction that even today in philosophy, we talk about like distributive versus collective property.
Absolutely.
And here, there's actually like a whole debate about like set theory and like whether sets exist and stuff. But like they kind of like elegantly got around that problem with this perioptic.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's so cool. Okay, so let's talk about how they conceived of space and time.